It's July 8th, and what was supposed to be a week-long display of total unity for the Islamic Republic has instead turned into one of the clearest public windows we've had in years, into just how divided Iran's leadership actually is right now. Millions of mourners have poured into the streets of Tehran for the funeral of slain Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. But underneath the black clothing, the chest beating, and the chants of death to America, a real power struggle is playing out between two camps that both technically run the same government, and it's spilling into public view in front of international cameras that Iran cannot fully control. Let's start with what's actually confirmed, because the funeral itself has become genuinely strange television. Khamenei's body has been lying in state since July 3rd at the Imam Khomeini Mosalla complex in Tehran, alongside the coffins of 4 family members killed in the same February 28th airstrike that killed him. Ceremonies have moved through multiple cities on a tightly scripted schedule: Tehran, then Qom, then across the border into the Iraqi cities of Najaf and Karbala, before a planned burial in Khamenei's hometown of Masoud. Iranian state media has shown enormous crowds, men and women dressed in black, women striking their heads in mourning, men beating their chests in unison in a traditional Shia practice, and repeated chants of death to America and death to Israel. Large red signs reading "Kill Trump" have appeared throughout the crowd. During the procession through Tehran, mourners reportedly took part in a symbolic stoning ritual, throwing pebbles at an image of President Trump, a practice normally reserved for a very different kind of target in Islamic tradition. One mourner holding an image of Trump carried a message reading simply, "There will be blood." This is, by any measure, an extraordinary scene. A foreign government using its own head of state's funeral as a platform for open threats against a sitting American president, broadcast on state television to the entire country and picked up by international outlets present in Tehran with government permission. But the more interesting story isn't what's happening on camera, it's what's happening underneath it. Because this funeral has become a stage for a genuine internal power struggle that Iran's leadership clearly did not want the world to see this clearly. Here's the fault line. On one side sits what's often described as the pragmatist camp, led by President Masoud Pezeshkian and Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the men who have actually been negotiating with the United States, first to end the war, and now over the long-term terms governing the Strait of Hormuz. This camp is currently ascendant within the government and reportedly managed to convince the elder Khamenei, before his death, to support negotiations with Washington as a way to ease Iran's collapsing economy. On the other side sits the hardline faction tied more directly to the Revolutionary Guard, deeply skeptical of any negotiation and openly hostile toward the men currently sitting across the table from American officials. According to reporting on internal regime dynamics, hardliners have gone so far as to call publicly for the prosecution, and in some cases the death, of Iran's own negotiators, the same men representing Iran in Doha, for the crime of negotiating with the country that killed their supreme leader in the first place. Think about what that actually means. Iran's own hardline faction is calling for its own government's diplomats to be prosecuted, or worse, for doing exactly what Iran's surviving leadership authorized them to do. That is not a unified government putting on a unified front. That is a regime fracturing along a fault line that's existed in various forms since the earliest years of the Islamic Republic, now blown wide open by the pressure of losing a war, losing a supreme leader, and having to negotiate from a position of real weakness for the first time in decades. The funeral itself has become a proxy battlefield for that fight. Iran's parliament speaker, Ghalibaf, who also serves as the country's chief negotiator with Washington, told reporters during the ceremonies that implementing the ceasefire agreement his government signed is, in his words, difficult but achievable, a fairly measured statement given the crowd around him chanting for an American president's death in the same breath. That's the pragmatist wing trying to hold a negotiating position together while standing in the middle of a funeral explicitly engineered by hardliners to project maximum defiance. And the absences at this funeral are arguably more revealing than who actually showed up. Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, still has not appeared publicly at his own father's funeral more than 4 months after taking the position. Reporting indicates Iranian security officials specifically rejected his request to attend the burial in Mashhad out of fear that either attending or being tracked back to wherever he's currently hiding could get him killed, particularly after Israel's defense minister publicly stated this past week that Mojtaba had been, in his own words, marked for death. Yet nearly every other senior regime official, heads of all 3 branches of government, senior Revolutionary Guard commanders, and Quds Force leadership did attend, standing in the open in a crowd that Israel has repeatedly demonstrated it can strike. If the security threat to Mojtaba is genuinely so severe that he can't risk attending his own father's burial, why is virtually every other senior official in the entire regime able to stand in that same crowd without apparent hesitation? That contradiction hasn't gone unnoticed by analysts watching the succession closely, and it's fueling real speculation about what's actually keeping him out of view, whether it's the security threat as officially stated, the severity of injuries he reportedly sustained in February, or uncertainty about his actual standing within a leadership structure that's still sorting out who holds real power now that his father's gone. 3 of Khamenei's other sons did appear, standing beside their father's coffin alongside former President Mohammad, whose appearance was notable in its own right, given years of public estrangement from the Khamenei family before this. The specific senior appointments Khamenei is expected to make once the funeral concludes are being watched closely inside Iran as the clearest signal yet of which faction, the pragmatists or the hardliners, actually holds the upper hand going forward. Now, it's worth being genuinely careful about what the size of these crowds actually tells us, because that's exactly the kind of claim that gets wildly overstated in every direction, depending on who's doing the analyzing. Historians studying Iran specifically caution against reading crowd size at a funeral like this as any kind of referendum on the regime's popularity. As one professor of modern Iranian history put it, if anyone thinks this is a litmus test for how popular the Islamic Republic actually is, history says otherwise, because Iranians, whatever their politics, tend to observe funerals with genuine cultural and religious seriousness. Reporters who spoke with people actually attending these ceremonies found many who described themselves as spectators, or who said they were there out of religious duty within a country with deep Shia traditions around mourning, rather than out of any specific political loyalty to the regime itself. That doesn't mean the crowds aren't real, or that support for hardline positions doesn't exist. It means treating turnout numbers as a clean measurement of regime popularity in either direction is analytically sloppy. And it's worth being honest about that, rather than pretending a crowd size settles the argument. What is measurable and considerably more damning is the regime's own recent history with its people. According to an Iranian human rights monitoring organization, the Revolutionary Guard was responsible for killing at least 7,000 people during nationwide anti-government protests that erupted in December of last year. One woman in Tehran, whose brother was killed during those January protests, told a reporter that watching Khamenei's funeral gave her little comfort, speaking on condition of anonymity, out of fear of government retaliation for saying so publicly. That's the backdrop this funeral is actually unfolding against. A regime staging an enormous, expensive, days-long spectacle of national mourning in a country where a meaningful number of citizens have direct, personal recent experience of that same regime's security forces killing their own family members in the streets. Iran's Revolutionary Guard, for its part, has responded to this entire moment with a posture that's more threat than mourning. In a statement issued ahead of the funeral, the Guard warned that any miscalculation, meaning any attempt by Israel or the United States to strike during the ceremonies, would be met with what it called a decisive and more crushing response than ever before. Language, it said, would be forever recorded in what it described as the shameful history of its enemies. That statement came directly in response to Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz's comments marking Mojtaba Khamenei for death, comments Katz has since doubled down on publicly, standing at the funeral procession itself and vowing that any future Iranian leader who tries to harm Israel will face the same fate as his predecessor, framing the elder Khamenei's killing explicitly as an assassination carried out because he set in motion what Katz called the plan to destroy Israel. So layer all of this together and you get an extraordinarily volatile picture. A funeral meant to project unity that instead exposed a real public rift between pragmatist negotiators and hardliners, calling for those same negotiators' prosecution. A new supreme leader who remains unseen, whether from genuine fear, physical incapacity, or uncertain political standing, while nearly every other senior official in the regime appears openly. Israel's defense minister, standing at the funeral procession itself, essentially confirming the assassination and promising more of the same for whoever comes next. And underneath all of it, technical negotiations over Iran's economic survival and the future of one of the most important shipping corridors on the planet paused specifically for this funeral period, waiting to resume once the ceremonies conclude, being conducted by a delegation that hardliners inside its own government are calling traitors in public. This kind of open factional warfare is not new in the Islamic Republic. The tension between more pragmatic, negotiation-minded officials and hardline factions tied closely to the Revolutionary Guard has existed in various forms for decades, flaring up repeatedly during moments of real national stress, economic crises, contested elections, periods of international pressure. What's different this time is the scale of the crisis forcing that tension into the open. Iran isn't managing a routine political disagreement about domestic policy. It's managing the aftermath of losing its own head of state to a foreign strike, absorbing the destruction of major nuclear infrastructure, fighting an active insurgency in its own western provinces, and negotiating from a position of genuine weakness with the same countries that inflicted all of that damage. Every one of those pressures pushes the underlying factional tension closer to the surface. And this funeral, ironically the event most explicitly designed to project unity and continuity, appears to have done exactly the opposite. There's also a broader question worth sitting with here, about what happens once the mourning period actually ends. Ghalibaf's own public acknowledgement that implementing the ceasefire is difficult but achievable is a notably candid admission for a senior official to make in the middle of a funeral designed to project strength. It suggests the pragmatist camp understands just how fragile their negotiating position actually is, both externally with Washington and internally against a hardline faction that would clearly prefer confrontation to compromise. If Khamenei's post-funeral appointments favor the hardliners, as some Iranian officials cited in recent reporting suggest could happen, the entire diplomatic track currently being managed through Doha and Qatari and Pakistani mediation could shift dramatically and quickly once the cameras move on from Tehran. So where does this actually leave things? Does the pragmatist camp, currently ascendant but publicly challenged by hardliners calling for their prosecution, manage to hold onto enough influence to keep negotiations with Washington moving forward once the funeral period ends and technical talks resume? Or does the very public infighting on display this week signal that hardliners are gaining real ground, positioning themselves to derail the diplomatic track entirely in the appointments and maneuvering that follow Khamenei's burial in Mashhad? Does Mojtaba Khamenei ever actually step into public view? And if he does his first real appearance signal a leader in genuine command of a fracturing government, or a figurehead being managed and positioned by the very Revolutionary Guard commanders who now surround him constantly? And does Israel's explicit, repeated marking of Mojtaba for death end up deterring further violence, the way deterrence theory suggests it should? Or does it simply guarantee that whoever actually holds power in Tehran keeps operating from the shadows indefinitely, running a nuclear-adjacent oil-critical state through intermediaries, rather than in the open? Nobody outside a very small circle in Tehran actually knows those answers right now. And given how badly this funeral itself misjudged how visible its own internal divisions would become, it's fair to assume Iran's leadership doesn't have full clarity on its own trajectory either. What's clear is that the spectacle this week was supposed to demonstrate unshakable continuity, and instead demonstrated the opposite. A government publicly split between those trying to negotiate Iran's way out of catastrophe and those who see that negotiation itself as a betrayal worth punishing. A new Supreme Leader too exposed, too uncertain, or too politically fragile to show his own face at his father's burial, and a funeral broadcast to the world that ended up telling a very different story than the one the regime intended, not of a nation unified in grief, but of a leadership structure still figuring out, in full public view, who's actually in charge. Watch what appointments come out of Tehran once the mourning period officially ends. Watch whether Ghalibaf and Pezeshkian's negotiating position survives contact with the hardliners currently calling for their heads. And watch whether Mojtaba Khamenei ever actually appears. Because how that resolves is going to tell you almost everything you need to know about who really controls Iran going forward.